Good evening, everyone. It's a great pleasure to have with us this evening Professor Alan Stewart. In addition to being the national recorder for Leafhoppers and Allies that he's going to talk about this evening, he's also a very distinguished ecologist. And I think he's going to give us a picture in the round as well as the nitty-gritty of identifying and recording springtails. He's going to tell us a little bit about their background and their ecology. So quite a lot to get through. Thank you very much, Alan. Over to you.
Thank you, Alan. Just a quick correction, not springtails.
Oh, did I say springtails? Oh, my apologies.
That's all
Uh,
right. Anybody
leaf
who's come wanting to hear about
leaf
springtails
hoppers and
going to be
allies.
disappointed. Going to be disappointed. Anyway, thank you for the introduction. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for tuning in. I have, as Alan said, I've got the privilege of looking after the National Recording Scheme for Leafhoppers and Allied groups. And I'm also verifier on iRecord, so I may have verified some of your records, perhaps, and you may have had some correspondence with you. Okay, so if this is going to work, yes. I usually sort of try and start these workshop sessions by asking the basic question, why leafhoppers? Why is this a group that's worth paying any attention to? There's currently 426 species and counting. We seem to be accumulating new species almost every month, but that's the current total. And I think that's quite a good sort of number to sort of get to grips with, really. It's not too big. It's not a question of thousands of species like some beetles and perhaps flies and so on. And yet it's a large enough group of species such that when you visit a site, you're going to be able to find probably a good collection of species across several different families. So it's a nice size group, I think. And as you'll hear, a lot of them are identifiable, certainly to genus level, if not to species level, in the field with practice, of course. So that's good. We are now in the privileged position of having a really excellent set of resources for identification for this particular group. There are several books and keys and so on, which I'll talk about a little bit later. There's lots of online resources. There's some excellent photo galleries, which you can look at online and so on. So the support for identification has never been better. So there's a lot of support there. We also, I think, know a good amount about the sort of fundamental natural history of this group in terms of what plants they feed on. I should say at the outset that all of the leafhoppers and related groups are herbivorous, so they all feed on plants. There aren't any predatory or parasitic species or anything like that. They're all herbivores. So we have very good knowledge of what plants they feed on. Through accumulating records through the recording scheme, we've got a pretty good idea of the geographical distribution in Britain of all of the species. And that helps us to establish their status in terms of commonness and rarity as well, about which we know quite a lot as well. One of the things that I'm very keen on promoting myself is the whole idea that this group is a very good group as indicators of what you might call site quality for sort of conservation purposes. This applies particularly to certain habitats like grasslands and heathlands and some of the wetter boggy habitats I'll talk about later. But we can tell a lot from a list of species for a particular site about that site quality. We can use that as a measure of not just site quality at one point in time, but how a site changes over time, perhaps recovers from some sort of intervention. So they're very good indicators from that point of view. A few species, not so much in this country, but certainly around the world, there are a lot of pest species on our crops and so on that cause a lot of damage. Not so many of those in this country, although with a little bit of climate warming, we seem to be getting more and more of them, but not too many of them are pest species, but those that are very important. As I'll talk about a little bit later, they're very easy to collect or to sample in the field, number of different collection techniques that you can use. And I hope that by the end of this session, you'll agree with me that they're actually a very, very attractive group of insects. Some of them are very colourful, with very interesting, intricate patterns and so on. So that's my pitch for why you should take this group, take them seriously. Let's just start off then by just making sure we know where we are, so to speak. So we're in the Hemiptera, the bugs. So that's the order that have two pairs of wings, of course, but particularly the piercing and sucking mouth parts. And they're typically divided into two suborders, the Homoptera and Heteroptera. Some people have elevated those to order level, but we'll pass over that. So on the one hand, there's the Heteroptera, which are sometimes referred to as the true bugs. So these are things like shield bugs, ground bugs, mirids, capsid bugs, that sort of thing. We go down the other branch on the left-hand side there to the Homoptera, where unlike the Heteroptera, which have wings that are divided into sort of two unequal sections, one section sort of a bit leathery and the other section membranous, in the Homoptera, the wings are uniform in texture all the way through, either fairly thin and membranous and transparent, or sort of a bit thicker and more leathery, but uniform in texture all the way through. Those then divide into these two groups with long and unpronounceable names, the Auchenorrhyncha and the Auchenorrhyncha. So the Auchenorrhyncha really are the sort of preserve very much of the professional entomologist, I think, because they do include a lot of pest species, whiteflies and aphids and so on. On the other side, we've got the Auchenorrhyncha, which we're concentrating on tonight, which are all hoppers, the leafhoppers, planthoppers, froghoppers, and so on. So that's where we are. And the Auchenorrhyncha are divided. Oh, there are 10 families which are divided into these sort of two big groups, the Cicadomorpha and the Fulguromorpha. Don't need to worry too much about those. But essentially, there are these 10 families which are listed there, and the figures in brackets are the number of species in each of those families. And so, of course, you can see straight away that they're very unevenly divided. The total number of species are very unevenly divided between these 10 families. And in fact, the vast majority are in just the two families, the Cicadelidae, the leafhoppers, and the Delphasidae, the plant or group of planthoppers. And then we've got after that a couple of smallish groups, the froghoppers and the Cixiidae. But then all the rest are families that have got just either one or two species in them. So I want to have a look through those families in a second, but I just want to make a distinction here between the Cicadomorpha and the Fulguromorpha, because that divides the whole of the group into two logical chunks. The Cicadomorpha are very easy to tell apart from the Fulguromorphs in the sense that they've got this sort of much more rounded appearance. As you can see, both on the top and the bottom picture on the left-hand side there, the face is very rounded, whereas in a lot of the Fulguromorpha, particularly the Delphasids, have these longitudinal keels or ridges down the face and over the top of the head. Now, that's not the case in every single group, but it's a fairly useful sort of distinction between the two big groups. So I like to start with this distinction because this covers a significant number of the total species that we're talking about. It's a very simple starting point for people who are not familiar with this particular group in terms of distinguishing between at least three of the main families. And that's to look directly at the hind tibia, and specifically the spines that run down the tibia. So if you look at the hind leg on the right-hand side, which is a typical leafhopper, you'll see that the leafhoppers, Psychedelidae, have these rows, certainly one, usually two rows of backward pointing spines running all the way down the hind tibia. The middle group, on the other hand, which are the froghoppers, the Aphrophoridae and the Cercopidae, instead have just a couple of sort of fairly large, stout, backward pointing spines on the hind tibia, and then sort of little group of backward pointing spines at the end of the tibia where it meets the first tarsal segment. I don't know whether my cursor is showing up on everybody's screen. Can you see my cursor? Yeah,
Yes, we can
okay,
see
great.
it.
Okay, good, thank you. So that's the second group. And then the third group, which are the planthoppers, or the delphacid planthoppers at least, have got a different structure again. So here's the hind tibia, a couple of minute spines, which you probably normally wouldn't even notice. But then between the end of the tibia and the first tarsal segment, we've got this, what here is labeled as a post-tibial calcar. Most people refer to it as just a spur. And it's essentially a movable thumb, if you like, that the insect uses to sort of brace itself as it walks up the plant stem. Now, as far as I know, that particular structure, that movable spur, is unique in all insects. I don't think there's any other group that's got that particular structure. So if you find an insect, particularly something that looks like a leaf or planthopper, with that structure, you're straight away into that family, the Delphacidae. So starting off with one of those families then, the Cercopidae and the Aphrophoridae. These are what we tend in Britain to call the froghoppers, what the Americans like to call spittlebugs, and some people probably would refer to as cuckoo spit insects by virtue of the fact that it's the nymphs, the immature stages, that produce the so-called cuckoo spit that you see quite frequently in the springtime, sort of from April, May and June time. And that's a sort of foamy substance that's produced by the nymphs surrounding themselves in this stuff as they feed on the plant. The conventional theory being that it protects them from desiccation, but also possibly from predators as well. But it's a structure that's produced by that particular family and that family alone. And there are two, well, sorry, there are two families actually. There's the Cercopidae and the Aphrophoridae, but they both are referred to as froghoppers or spittlebugs. And there's a few examples on the screen there. Now, I think this, from the point of view of people just starting out in this group who perhaps hadn't had any experience of it before, this is a very good place to start because there are three species in the Aphrophoridae, in the froghoppers, that are extremely common and widespread. And if you go out to really most sites, probably certainly grassland or a waste ground site or something like that, you're almost certainly likely to find at least two, if not three, of these species. They're very, very common and very widespread. So I think from the point of view of a newcomer to the group, this is a very good place to start to sort of get really familiar with these three species, which you're bound to come across pretty soon. And once you're familiar with those, it'll give you a bit of sort of confidence in tackling some of the other more challenging species. So I'm just going to run through each of those and just say a little bit about them to help with the identification. So firstly, Auchenorrhyncha Recording, sometimes referred to as the alder spittlebug. This is the largest of them, between 9 and 10 millimeters long, quite a substantial insect. Slightly sort of inflated wings at the side, or extended wings, I should say, at the side, giving them a sort of a slightly diamond overall shape and quite pointed at the rear end. The whole of the dorsal surface, you can see in the top right there, is covered with little black dots, which are in fact little tiny pits, which is, whoops, sorry, which is very distinctive. And they also have these two sort of pale, like sort of thumbprints on the side of the wing, on the leading edge of the wing. So that's the largest of the three species. Um, the next one is perhaps one of our commonest spittlebugs. This is Phalaenus bimaris, sometimes referred to as the meadow spittlebug. Sort of medium sized, slightly smaller than the previous one, more of an oval outline rather than sort of diamond-shaped outline. This time, though, the whole of the dorsal surface, the wings and the head and thorax and so on, covered with you can't see them in this picture, but covered with tiny, tiny pale white hairs, which is different from the previous species. And this species is interesting from the fact that it occurs in an extraordinary array of different color forms. So you can see a selection of those on the top right there. So they occur as individuals from sort of pale yellowish brown right through to completely black, and all sorts of patterns and colors in between. But the two, sort of one of the commonest patterns, or one of the commonest morphs of this particular species, has those two white patches on the side of the wing that superficially makes it look a little bit like the previous species, the Auchenorrhyncha Recording. So sometimes they can get confused. And in fact, my experience with iRecord is that those are probably the two most frequently confused species that people find difficult to separate. And then the third froghopper species is one called Neophalanus lineatus, smaller again, 5 to 6 millimeters, much more sort of parallel-sided than either of the previous two, much more slender, with these sort of dark and light flash lines down the leading edge of the wing. Slight difference in the sexes, as with most species. So on the top right there, you can see there's a male on the left and a female on the right in mating together. Now, the thing about these three species, as I say, is that they're very, very common. They represent different sizes, small, medium, and large. There's a table here that shows the basic differences in terms of the shape and the size and whether or not they have those fine hairs and the black punctures and so forth. So I think for, as I say, newcomers to this particular group, if we could get to grips with these three, really be able to recognize those in the field, that would be a big step forward. So one of the nice things about this particular trio of species is that they're very conveniently separated ecologically. So Neophalanus lineatus is a monocot feeder. In other words, it feeds on grasses, sedges, and rushes. Phalaenus bimaris mainly feeds on the sort of herbaceous layer, whereas Auchenorrhyncha Recording, the one on the right, primarily feeds on tree species, particularly willows and sallows, and alders and those sorts of species. So ecologically, they're quite nicely separated as well. Okay, so that's the froghoppers. Now we come on to the really big group, the Cicadelidae, with, as you can see in each of these pictures, I think, the row of backward pointing spines on the hind tibia. As you would expect with a group with a large number of species like this. So I'm just trying to move it. Yes, I moved it out of the way. As you would expect with a family like this with over 300 species, enormously variable in terms of size and color and pattern and so on, but they are at least linked together by the fact that they have these backward pointing spines on the hind tibia. Now, within the Cicadelidae, within the leafhoppers, there are 12 subfamilies. So I'm not going to go through all of those, but by any means. But I just want to point out two of them, which are quite important by virtue of the fact that actually together they make up the vast majority. I think about 3/4 of the species in the Cicadelidae and the leafhoppers are actually contained in two subfamilies. And one of them, the Deltacephalini at the bottom there, are distinguished by virtue where their ocelli are located. So in some of the leafhoppers, the ocelli, which are these little tiny light-sensitive organs on the head of insects, we're not quite sure what function they perform other than just being aware of where the light is coming from, whether the insect's the right way up or upside down or whatever. Um, these little sort of pinhead-like ocelli in some of the Cicadelidae are located on the top of the head, on the vertex. In some, they're located on the face, as you can see in the middle picture there. But in the Deltacephalini, they're located on the transition between the top of the head and the face, so right on that sort of transition zone. And they are an important group, well over 100 species, because they are probably the main group that we find in grasses and grasslands generally. Tend to be mainly sort of shades of yellow through to brown um, with black markings superimposed. So not necessarily the most colourful group, but nevertheless a very distinctive one. And a very, very important group from the point of view of species richness in grasslands. I put in the one on the bottom right here because that one is a bit of an exception to the rule, because this is a species from a group within the Deltacephalini which do feed on grasses, but they are often referred to as what are called vertical migrants. In other words, they lay their eggs on herbaceous plants and grasses down at the sort of ground level, and the nymphs hatch out, the young larvae or nymphs hatch out and feed on those low-growing plants initially. But when the adults emerge from those nymphs eventually, they migrate up into the canopy um, and feed primarily up in the main part of the tree. And then presumably they come down again to lay their eggs. So there's a little group of these Deltacephalini species which uh, spend quite a bit of time moving vertically from the sort of the ground layer up into the canopy layer. The other big subfamily within the cicadelids, within the leafhoppers, are the Typhlosibinae. I mentioned these separately because, again, there's a large number of species, over 100 species. These are the ones that tend to be small and fairly delicate leafhoppers. They are distinguished from other leafhoppers by virtue of the fact that three main veins in the forewing are not forked or branched at all in the basal 2/3. So you can perhaps see that best in this one in the bottom right here, where you can see there's the three main veins, radial, median, and cubital vein there, which are unbranched until they get towards towards the tip. So this is a very important group because the great majority of these small and relatively delicate species are tree-feeding species. There is one genus that we have down on the bottom right here, the genus Eupteryx, which are mainly herbaceous feeding leafhoppers, feeding on things like nettles and labiates and so on. But most of the rest of the group are feeders on trees, on the main deciduous tree species. Next family of the membracids. This is essentially a tropical family of hoppers, so-called tree hoppers. We only have two species in this country. Really, they are mainly tropical in distribution. Distinguished by the fact that the pronotum, which is the front part of the thorax, has got this substantial backward extension. You can see it's almost like a sort of dagger-like structure, which stretches back over the top of the abdomen, top of the wings. As I say, we have two species in this country, Centrotus cornutus, which is a species that feeds mainly on oak, and probably other tree species as well. But also a slightly smaller one, Gargara geniste, which is a specialist species on broom. So if you've got broom in your particular area, it's well worth having a look to see whether you can find this little hopper. Um, both of these species, but particularly the second one, Gargara geniste, is supposed to have some sort of symbiotic relationship with ants. But I don't think that's been particularly well studied as yet, but it's certainly something that would be worth looking at. Then the last of the cicada morpha are the cicadas. Now, this is again a tropical group primarily in terms of numbers of species and distribution. We only have historically one species in this country, which for a long time had its stronghold in the New Forest and was hence therefore known as the New Forest cicada. Sadly, there have been no confirmed sightings, no confirmed records of this species since 1995, so over 30 years now. So the consensus seems to be that it's likely to be extinct. Whether it is or not, I don't know. It's a very, very secretive, very difficult species to find and to study. It has a very, very short flight period in sort of May and early June. Like so many other cicadas, it will only perform in terms of calling and singing in hot temperatures when it's hot and sunny and not too breezy. And the call that it produces is nothing like the very noisy cicadas that probably people have experienced in the Mediterranean region. This one is very, very quiet, produces a song a bit like a sort of a soft hiss, which is of sufficiently high frequency that anybody over the age of about 40 can't hear it. So it's quite a difficult species to study. Plus the fact that it has a 7 or possibly 8 year life cycle. So most of the time it survives as a nymph underground, feeding on the roots of its host plants, and only pops up as an adult once every 7 or 8 years. So it's a difficult species to study. So my feeling is that it may well be extinct in Britain, but it may be hanging on in one or two places where people perhaps haven't looked. Who knows? We'll see. Okay, so that's the cicadomorpha. Let's now flip over to the fulguromorpha side of that table I showed at the beginning and talk about the planthoppers. And the biggest group here is the Delphacidae, nearly 80 species. All of which are recognizable by the fact that they have, as I said before, this sort of inward pointing spur at the end of the hind tibia. And so you can see it in that picture there. There it is again, a little bit blurry, but there it is again down there. Now these plant hoppers tend to be sort of shades of yellow through to brown with dark markings. As you can see, none of them are particularly colourful in terms of having bright colours like reds and blues and so on. But nevertheless, very, very distinctive in terms of their overall patterning and shape and so on, and a very important component of the grassland fauna. Moving on to the last few families, the Cixiidae, just 10 species. They have membranous, sort of semi-transparent forewings, where the veins are mostly longitudinal, very few cross veins. Quite a number of them, this one here, Tachycexius, but also other species in the genus Cixius, have little black dots along the wing veins, which mark the positions of very small hairs, and that I think has prompted some people to call some of these hoppers lace hoppers, with gives this sort of rather sort of lacy appearance. But it's not universal throughout the family, because as you can see on the left-hand side here, Pentasteridius doesn't have those dots along the veins. However, one feature which is consistent through this family is the scutellum, which is the rear part of the thorax, has either got three longitudinal keels or ridges running through it, or in the case of this group over here, five of those keels. So either three or five keels running through the scutellum puts you immediately into this succeed family. And then the last little group of families are the ones with just either two or one species, or in fact, all of them have got two species. The Isidae, these are curious little things with very thick, sort of leathery forewings with lots and lots of cross veins in addition to the main longitudinal veins. Got two species in this country, one of which is pretty common actually, Isis coleoptratus, often found on ivy and holly. In fact, there was a Christmas card a few years ago where it was presented as the Christmas plant hopper by virtue of feeding on holly and ivy. But the other species in the family in the genus rather, Isis musciformis, is very, very local. Found only sort of down the western seaboard of England and Wales. So an interesting pair of species there, one very common, one very rare. Tetragometra is an interesting family. For a long time, we thought we only had one species, the top one here, Tetragometra impressipunctata, with its very characteristic covering all over the dorsal surface with these little black pits, little black spots. Really rare species, a species mainly associated with chalk grassland, where it's a very good indicator actually of a really high quality chalk grassland. But in the last few years, last 5 or 6 years, we've found another species, Tetragometra virescens, this rather splendid green plant hopper, which now seems to be popping up in lots of different places in Kent and Essex, and most recently in Sussex. So that's a nice new addition to the fauna. And then very excitingly, the last family has literally been only added to the British list in the last 2 or 3 years. This is another primarily sort of tropical family, so it's not surprising that we have very few species and only have one species so far. It's in the family Flattidae. And these are plant hoppers that have got these sort of rather tent-like wings that are held vertically over the abdomen. There's a really interesting story behind this, actually, which is that this particular species, Psiphopteron retusum, was first found back in 2024, only a couple of years ago, by the warden at Portland Bird Observatory, who was running a light trap in the Bird Observatory garden, and found this particular plant hopper cropping up in his light trap really quite regularly. And it turns out, in fact, that it's really relatively common in the garden of the Bird Observatory, and it's also been found in a couple of places in and around Weymouth, which is just inland from Portland. So how far that will spread, we'll see. But it's an interesting species because previously it's only been recorded for Madeira. So quite how it got to Britain, how it got to Portland is an interesting question, and indeed how far it will spread remains to be seen. Okay, so those are the main families. What I thought I'd do now is just very quickly run through some common species that people either might already know or might easily come across as soon as we get into spring and into summer. Perhaps one of the most distinctive of these is the froghopper in the Cercopidae, the Cercopis vulnerata, sometimes referred to as the rather unimaginatively as the red and black froghopper. Um, this is our only member of the Cercopid family, very conspicuous thing, can't really mistake it for anything else. Another early season species. So typically you find it in May. By the end of May, early June, it's probably pretty much finished and gone. Um, in contrast to the other members of the froghopper group, um, the nymphs, the immature stages, feed on plant roots underground. So in normal course of events, you wouldn't come across them. You only find this species when it emerges above ground as this rather colourful adult. And as you can see from the map, it's pretty widespread, certainly in England and Wales. Up until relatively recently, it didn't go much further north than about sort of Durham, that sort of area. But whether it's as a result of general climate warming or some other factor, it's been gradually spreading north. Um, and 2023, I think it was the first time that it broke into Scotland in Berwickshire. So this is a species that's clearly expanding northwards, but certainly in the majority of England and Wales, it's a pretty common, widespread, and very, very distinctive species. Another very distinctive one, Graphocephala fennei, the so-called rhododendron leafhopper, by virtue of the fact that it feeds exclusively on rhododendrons. A large species with these distinctive red lines through a green background. It's a non-native species in this country, so it was introduced with imported rhododendrons back in the 1930s. So nearly 100 years ago, in London, I think in Kew Gardens, in fact, and has been spreading ever since. And as you can see, it's pretty widespread in southeast England and along the south coast, but has got up as far as sort of the Merseyside area and even up into the Lake District. So this is another species that's clearly gradually expanding, but unmistakable, can't really mistake it for anything else. So if you grow rhododendrons in your garden, keep a lookout for it. Cicadella viridis, we've seen this in sort of passing already. This is very large, very distinctive leafhopper, distinctive green and sort of blue through to black coloration. Interesting difference between the males and the females. So we've got a female on the left-hand side mating with a male on the right-hand side. See, the female is a sort of slightly bluey green color, whereas the males can be really sparkling bluish right through to this one, which is more black. So quite a difference between the males and the females. Feeds on rushes. So really anywhere that you've got sort of damp grassland, grading into fenland, anything like that, you'll find this species, and it's often very, very common, often very, very abundant. And as you can see, very widespread throughout England, Wales, right up through Scotland. Another very distinctive species, Ledra aurita. So this is a species that where the pronotum has got these sort of side extensions. We can see one poking out the back on one side there. That's given it the nickname the eared leafhopper. It's actually our largest leafhopper, largest cicadellid, nearly 2 centimeters long. And as you might imagine, when it's sitting on tree bark or something, it feeds primarily on oak trees and other large trees. When it's sitting on bark, that's particularly if it's got a sort of lichen on it and so on, it's incredibly well camouflaged and very difficult to see. The interesting thing about it is that most of the records for this particular species come from light traps, where people have been running a light trap for moths or whatever, usually moths, and one of these things has popped in. Interestingly, the nymphs are quite often found by beating the lower branches of trees. um, but very rarely the adults. So that sort of says to me that probably the nymphs are in the lower branches, perhaps right the way through the tree, but the adults are out of reach, so to speak, for normal sweeping or beating, and probably much further up into the canopy, but and only come down to sort of ground level, and they're attracted by the lights. Um, Common and widespread in southern England, and probably also spreading gradually sort of north and west, from what we can see. Last of the sort of the distinctive species, Centrotus cornutus. I've already shown this as one of the tree hoppers with the backward pointing sort of spine from the thorax. This one also has sort of little horns pointing sideways as well. So some people have decided to call it the horned tree hopper. Um, Basically a woodland species, feeds on a number of different trees, possibly ant-associated, as I said before. This one, interestingly, clearly very widespread in England and Wales, but also goes right up the west coast of Scotland as well. Not many records so far, but I wouldn't mind betting that it's reasonably common up there. Never particularly common numerically, in the sense that usually you only find them in ones and twos, but seemingly, sort of nevertheless quite widespread. Okay, I thought I'd mention just a few species that are expanding their range, which might be worth people looking out for. This is an interesting one. This is Auchenorrhyncha clavicornis, which is a delphacid planthopper. Has these very distinctive, flattened and expanded forelegs and antennae. Really very distinctive creature. Can't really mistake it for anything else. As you can see, it's mainly in the sort of the south and the east of the country. It's had a bit of a interesting sort of checkered history, really, in the sense that it used to be fairly widespread in that area. Then in about the sort of 1980s, 1990s, it seemed to contract right down to a relatively small area around sort of Greater London and the Thames estuary. But then in the last probably 10 to 15 years, it seems to have started to expand again. And whether it really is expanding its range or whether it's just simply building up its numbers so it becomes more obvious and people come across it more often is an interesting question. But it seems to be expanding its range at least northwards. So for those of you in Leicestershire and Rutland, it was first recorded there, as you can see, in 2023, a few years, 2 or 3 years ago. And I expect will now sort of gradually move further and further north and west. Another interesting species that's also expanding its range. This used to be very rare. This used to be confined to sort of coastal salt marshes and so on in the southeast, mostly around London and the Thames estuary, that sort of area. But again, over the last 20, 30 years, has clearly expanded its range very considerably. And as you can see, got to Vice County 55, Leicestershire and Rutland, just a few years ago, and has accumulated quite a few records in that county since. Then we move on to some of the more interesting recent arrivals, in other words, new species to Britain. This one is probably one of the most spectacular in terms of success. This was first recorded in the London area in 2010, but in the short time since then, 15 years since then, as you can see, it spread right up through the country and has now got as far as the central belt of Scotland. And is probably one of the most frequently recorded species on iRecord, from what I remember. It's a tree-feeding species, feeds on sycamore. Sycamores are very common, of course, so it's perhaps not surprising that it's doing very, very well. Another species that's also doing very well for a different reason is this one, Auchenorrhyncha notata. This is one of the Tiflocybine, Tiflocybine family. This one feeds on sage, particularly on garden sage. First arrived in the UK, or was first recorded, I should say, in 2002. As you can see, reached VC55 not too many years later, and is now busy spreading right throughout the country. And I'm sure that's because it gets it hitches a ride on sage plants when they get sold to people for their gardens through the horticultural trade. Another arrival, again one that has appeared in Leicestershire, but only appeared in Britain for the first time in 2001. Another species, another Tiflocybine species, this one feeding on sycamore, which again has spread very, very widely throughout at least England and Wales up to sort of Yorkshire area. And then lastly, I put this one in as another recent arrival for people to look out for if you are located in Leicestershire and Rutland. First recorded in 2008, again in the London area. Most of these new arrivals seem to appear first in London and then sort of spread out from there. So first appeared in London in 2008, now busy spreading throughout England at least, and is reasonably widespread. Feeds on everybody's favourite plant, Lawson cypress, this thing that people plant to shield themselves from their neighbours. And where it does occur, it can be very, very common. Hasn't yet appeared in Leicestershire. So there's a challenge for you, for those of you who are Leicestershire people. You can go out tomorrow, shake a few Lawson cypress trees, and I wouldn't be surprised if this thing doesn't drop out. It's a Tiflocybine by virtue of the fact that the three main veins of the forewing are unbranched in the basal two-thirds, as I mentioned before. But the interesting thing about this one, and I think unique within the family, at least of the species in Britain, is that it's got these little cross veins, 3 or 4 cross veins along the leading edge of the wing, and that immediately, together with its green colour, gives you an immediate identification. Okay, so let's just say a little bit very quickly about sort of background ecology of these insects. As I mentioned at the beginning, they're all herbivores, they all feed on plants. As you can imagine, with over 400 species, there's going to be a whole range of different tactics, if you like, strategies for exploiting plants. Some of them are highly specialist in the sense that they feed only on a single plant species. Some of them are very, very broad generalists. So, for example, Felinus spumarius, the meadow spittlebug, which I mentioned earlier, we did an analysis a few years ago on sort of cataloguing all the plant species that it feeds on, and the current total is 1,311. So this is a species that's very, very catholic in its tastes for different plant species. But as I say, likewise, there are other species that are very, very specialized in feeding only on a single plant species. They all tap into the plant's transport system, the liquids in the plants. There's a small group that tap into the xylem, which of course are the tubes that bring the water and the nutrients up from the roots to distribute through the plant. Now, because xylem is under very strong negative pressure, you have to have a pretty large and powerful insect to be able to suck this stuff out. So xylem is only exploited by a relatively small group of species amongst the Auchenorrhyncha, amongst the hoppers generally. So it's utilized by the cicadas, it's utilized by all of those froghoppers, and 2 or 3 of the larger cicadelids, 2 or 3 of the larger leafhoppers. But they're all linked by the fact that they have very, very pronounced sort of bulbous kind of faces. And the reason for that is that inside that face, they have a very strong pump mechanism to actually suck the contents of the xylem out. If they were much smaller insects, they wouldn't be able to do that. So there's a small group, I think it's about 17 or 18 species that feed on xylem. Then there's another group, which conveniently is also one of the subfamilies, which is the Typhlocybernae, which we've mentioned before, those sort of relatively small, delicate leafhoppers that feed on the mesophyll cell content. So these are the cells between the upper and the lower leaf lamina. And what happens here is that they suck out the contents of these cells cell by cell. They go from one cell to the next. So what happens is that they suck out the green chlorophyll contents of the cell, and then they move on to the next cell. When they move away from one particular cell, that cell refills with air and takes on a sort of slightly different color, slightly paler color, rather than green. And when you had a lot of feeding by these leafhoppers on a leaf, what you land up with is this sort of stippling effect that you can see on the in the picture on the right-hand side here. This is actually a nettle, where the little white stippling marks all over the leaves are where these little Typhlocybernae leafhoppers have been feeding. And in some cases, that feeding damage, as we call it, can be very extensive. So these are sycamore leaves later on in the season, and you can see that the amount of chlorophyll contents that's been sucked out of those leaves is really quite considerable. So they must be having quite an effect on the host plant. So that explains about sort of 100 and something species, and then all of the rest are leafhoppers and planthoppers that feed on the phloem. In terms of the plant species that they exploit, some interesting patterns here. I mean, this is some data that I've taken from a book by Herbert Nickel, who's worked extensively on the leafhoppers and planters in Germany. So considerably more species in Germany than there are in this country. So, don't take these figures too literally, but I'm sure the balance between different plant families is probably about the same in Britain. So what you can see here is that there's almost a half of the species, a good half of the species feed on grasses. And if you add to that the species that feed on the other monocots, the sedges and the rushes, you're getting up to something like about sort of 2/3, 3/4 of all of the hopper species feeding on these monocots. So that sort of emphasizes the fact that grasses and grasslands and sedges and rushes are very important resources for these species. But also, of course, there are quite a lot of species that feed on trees, particular broadleaf trees like willows and poplars and the birches and the oaks and so on are particularly important. But as you can see, quite a broad range, and this isn't a comprehensive list, of course, broad range of plant families that they feed on. Life cycle is fairly straightforward. Eggs laid usually inside the plant tissue, and then the little nymphs hatch out. Each nymph goes through a series of molts called instars, each one being slightly larger than the previous one until eventually they emerge as an adult insect with fully developed wings. Most species have either 1 or 2 generations a year. Sometimes in a very hot summer, they might squeeze in an extra one, but usually either 1 or 2 generations. And overwintering either in any of those stages. Some of them overwinter as eggs laid actually inside the plants. Some of them overwinter as nymphs, and some of them overwinter as adults. So it's impossible to sort of generalize too much on that. One other feature which is worth mentioning, I think, is the fact that some species have 2 different sort of morphological forms, a short-winged form and a long-winged form, so-called brachypterous and macropterous forms. You can see on the left-hand side here, the species Conomelus anceps, which is a very common species feeding on rushes in sort of wet grassland and fens and so on. The short-winged form on the top here and the long-winged form at the bottom, you can see are pretty similar, other than obviously the length of the wings. The wings have got these little black spots through them that run along the veins in both of those types. So it's logical and obvious to link them together as part of the same species. On the other hand, another delphacid, this one Chloriona, in the genus Chloriona, one of the common species in that genus, where the long-winged form below here looks very, very different to the short-winged form above. And in fact, what we've got here is a male which is long-winged and a female which is short-winged. And, putting those two side by side, you wouldn't normally think they're even the same species. But they are. They're just different forms of the and different sexes of the same species. So that's just in some species, that's just a sort of little extra complication. Okay, just a very quick canter through some of the typical habitats. I've sort of mentioned a lot of these in passing already. Grasslands clearly are very, very important for this group of insects. This is a lovely piece of species-rich chalk grassland near where I am in Sussex, which are very, very rich habitats for these species, particularly the delta cephaline species that I mentioned before. So examples along the bottom there. Woodlands, obviously very important for the tree feeding species. We've mentioned Ledra and Centrotus already. Quite a lot of or the majority of the Tiflocybine genera and species feed on trees. So, for example, Tiflocyberquercus here, this rather colourful little Tiflocybine, and some of the larger cicadelids like Yassus as well. One very productive habitat is sort of more or less anywhere wet, obviously not fully aquatic, but wet grassland grading into fen or marsh or even peat bogs, that sort of thing. Very, very productive habitats, particularly where they're rich in plant species as well. So I've already mentioned some of these species at the bottom here, Cicadella viridis and Conomelus, very, very common in that habitat, but this is a very, very species-rich habitat for these hoppers generally. And then heathland. Heathland's almost a sort of the opposite extreme in the sense that probably partly because it's a relatively species poor habitat from the plant point of view. So perhaps not surprisingly, it's not very species rich from the hopper point of view either. But the species that do occur there are very distinctive and often very specific to heathland. So Eulopa reticulator here, for example, at the bottom, very characteristic species that feeds on heather. Looks very much like a sort of little heather seed when it's in the net, actually, so quite difficult to spot. But other very distinctive species like little Tiflocybine zygena here, and some of the Cichsids as well. Okay, just say a little very quickly about collection methods. Basically, sweep netting and using beating trays for trees is sort of two absolutely standard methods that are used all the time. More recently, as in the last, I don't know, 10, 15 years, people are starting to use sort of converted leaf blowers, leaf blowing machines that are normally used for clearing up leaves and debris in the garden, converted from blowing to sucking and used as a suction sampler. Turns out to be very, very useful for getting into some otherwise inaccessible places, like in the depths of sort of thick grass tussocks, that kind of thing, or into the base of reed stems in a reed bed, for example. So very, very useful technique that has actually exposed quite a lot of species that we previously thought were much rarer, turned out to be more common than we thought, simply because we've developed a slightly different collection technique. So those are the sort of main techniques, but don't don't discount some of the other sort of standard entomological techniques, pitfall traps, pan traps, malaise traps, flight traps, and so on. I don't think, normally speaking, one would use any of these traps solely for catching leafhoppers, um, but they do catch them, and sometimes in quite surprising quantities, particularly if the weather is very hot in summer. So my recommendation here is to sort of pal up with somebody else who runs a light trap for catching moths, or a set of pitfall traps for catching ground beetles and spiders or whatever, and say to them, can I have your bycatch if you ever find any leafhoppers in your traps? Because some of these other techniques can be quite productive and can produce some quite interesting species. So just keep an eye out for that. Okay, do need to say just a little bit about the literature, specifically the identification literature behind this group of insects, because it's quite complicated, but also we're very fortunate in having a lot of resources to be able to draw from. Historically, these were the four Royal Entomological Society handbooks written by somebody called Walter Lecaine back in the 1960s through to 1981 in four separate handbooks. They're all out of print, so you possibly can find them on the sort of second-hand market, but they are also all downloadable for free as PDFs from the Royal EntSoc website, and you can see the link at the bottom of the screen there. A lot of people, I think, have sort of moved on, as it were, from using these handbooks to other ones, which I'll show you in a second. But I actually find them very, very useful, possibly because I was sort of brought up on them, as it were, when I first started studying this group. They're taxonomically extremely good. Not surprisingly, because the last one was published in 1981, quite some time ago. There are quite a lot of species that have appeared since then that they don't cover, so that's one disadvantage. They're written very much in the sort of old-fashioned, what I'd call the old-fashioned Royal EntSoc handbook style, where quite often the written keys are on one page and all the diagrams are on other pages, and so you have to sort of flip from page to page all the time, which is a bit annoying, and other features like that. But they do have that very distinct advantage that they have very good descriptions, written descriptions of each individual species. After you've keyed them through the standard keys, you're then given some pretty full descriptions to be able to match against the specimen that you're looking at. I find them very, very useful. So by all means, of course, download them, as I say, as PDFs from the Royal EntSoc website. What happened more recently is that our German colleagues produced this very substantial tome, The Planthoppers and Leafhoppers of Germany, originally in German, but we persuaded them to translate it into English, which is very kind of them. And this, I think, has now become sort of one of the standard sources of identification literature for the species in this country as well. Because, of course, there's a huge amount of overlap between species in this country and those in Germany. That was then followed a few years later, a couple of years later, by this picture book, essentially, which they call a photo atlas, which is it's a very, very useful adjunct to the main, what's become known as the Big German book. And the nice feature about this main text is that all of the species are arranged in columns. So you can compare species by looking across the columns. And all of the rows have a sort of common theme, in the sense that the top row is the whole insect and the various bits of the external features that are important, and then underneath various features of parts that need to be dissected out and so on. And then at the very bottom, some information about food plants and seasonal distribution and so on. All of the species have got exactly the same format, so you can compare them across the columns. What's even nicer is, and this is just the same page from the same book, is that the photo atlas, what they call the photo atlas, which is the picture book, fits very nicely aligned with the same columns. So you can literally put get the right page and put the color pictures below that fit into the same columns. That photo atlas is in German. The text is in German, but of course the pictures are international. Now, because not all of the species that are in the German book occur in Britain. There's about 600, I think, over 600 species in Germany. We only have 426. So there's quite a lot of species in that German book which we don't get in Britain. And likewise, there are a few species, not very many, but at the time only 19 species, which occur in Britain but don't occur in Germany. So some years ago, gosh, 10 years ago, Mike Wilson and I decided to persuade our German colleagues to produce this, what was called a supplement to their book, which is the Leafhoppers and Planthoppers of Britain and Ireland, where we basically tried to strip out all of the species that were in the German book that don't occur in Britain and add in those 19 extra species that we do have that they don't have in Germany, and a few other bits and pieces. So that sort of brings the whole thing more or less up to date, or as up to date as it was 10 years ago, but of course we've had a few species since then. Okay, time is moving on, I see. So I'll just flip very quickly through some of these last things. A lot of you will know about the British Bugs website, run by Tristan Bantock and Joe Botting. Fabulous resource of colour photos of lots and lots of species. It's only fair to say that it's not comprehensive in the sense that it doesn't cover every single species that you could find. But it's a very, very useful resource because after you've worked through a conventional key and come to some sort of conclusion as to what species it is you're looking at, it's reassuring to be able to pull up that species on this website and check out that it really does look like what it's supposed to look like. But of course, always with the caveat of being aware that you shouldn't lapse into the sort of lazy approach of just skimming through photographs just until you find something that looks about right according to the species you're looking at. But as I say, very, very useful resource, British Bugs website. Just say a little bit about the National Recording Scheme. This started back in the late 70s, set up by a chap called Keith Payne, who was working for the Nature Conservancy Council at the time. He set the whole thing up, did a lot of work to get it going and so on. Subsequently then passed it on to Walter Lacane, who wrote those identification handbooks, who did a huge amount of work in terms of extracting and abstracting data from museum collections in terms of distributions of individual species and so on. Unfortunately, he had to give it up due to ill health and then pass it on to me subsequently, and I've looked after it ever since. We now have about sort of 200,000 records-ish. Can't give you a very precise figure at the moment because it's changing all the time. With receiving records from all sorts of different sources. iRecord is the main one, but also iNaturalist, the NBN, of course, local record centres, individuals, county recorders, and so on and so forth. And we run a website, ledger.co.uk, which I'll show you in a second, with distribution maps. So, in fact, that is the front page of the Ledger website. This is just a screenshot, so I can't show you how it works. But for example, if you were to go to this species tab here, it'll bring up a sort of a pull-down menu, which includes going to distribution maps of all of the species, which is very useful for just checking to make sure that the species that you think you've got really does occur in that part of the country. Another thing that's just, again, very quickly worth mentioning is a review of the scarce and threatened Hemiptera. This actually includes not just the leafhoppers, but also the Heteroptera, so all of those shield bugs, myrid bugs, and so on. A review of the scarce and threatened Hemiptera that was done by Peter Kirby back in 1992. Fantastic resource of very, very useful information. You can see there's my well-thumbed copy on the left-hand side there. Um, the series of reviews of scarce and threatened insects and other groups has now been taken over by Natural England, and you can see one of the more recent ones that refers to particular groups of beetles in the middle there. I only show this because I've just started embarking on the process of updating Peter Kirby's original review, but this time with respect to the IUCN, International Union of Conservation Nature, red listing criteria, which many of you will be familiar with, where we categorize individual species according to whether they're least concerned, near threatened, or one of the three main threat categories. That's a pretty big exercise. We're only just starting on, and will probably take at least a couple of years to complete. So it'll be over the next this year and probably next year before it's actually completed. But hopefully at the end of that, we'll have a really clear statement of the relative commonness and rarity of all of our species as it stands at the moment. If you're interested, Tristan and I write an annual report in the journal British Wildlife, which some of you may read. It's a very good magazine, apart from anything else, but has lots of good reports all across all natural history. We write an annual report, just sort of outlining the major developments in leafhoppers and other hemipterans once a year. That's worth having a look at. And this is the sort of state of play we are at really with the recording scheme. So on the left-hand side, that's all species, all squares where there is at least one species, essentially, on the left-hand side. So pretty good coverage in England and Wales with some gaps, but pretty good coverage, but getting a bit thin in Scotland, sadly, and very, very thin in Ireland. Really only data from sort of the Dublin area and the West Coast and not much in between. So a lot of work to do there. And then on the right-hand side, one of these so-called sort of heat maps where the darker and the redder the colour, the more species essentially, gives you a bit of an indication as to where the sort of the hot spots are across the country. Okay, this is the very last slide, which is my plea to everybody to submit your records to the recording scheme. The easiest way to do that is through iRecord, which I'm sure a lot of you will be familiar with. If you don't get on with iRecord or prefer to send your records directly to me, that's absolutely fine. In pretty well any format, I can take them. I'm grateful for all records of any species. And as I'm sure you know, what we need is, obviously the name of the species, the location and the date and so on. I'm sure you're very familiar with that. Two little sort of associated pleas before I hand back. One is, I quite often get a comment from recorders who say, "Oh, well, I'll send you all the rare and interesting species, but I'm sure you don't want all the common ones, records of the common species." And I say, yes, please, you want records of anything and everything. Please don't hold back on the common species because they fill in the picture as well. So all species welcome. And the other point, which is I think worth mentioning right at the very end, is that until a record has been verified by whoever is verifying on iRecord or whatever other system you're putting records through, it's a very good idea to keep specimens. I know that not everybody has got the resources and the means to be able to do this on a big scale, and I understand that. But we have had quite a lot of cases, particularly just recently, where people have submitted records which we've had to query because we're not quite sure whether they're correct or not. But where unfortunately the recorder hasn't kept specimens, so there's no possibility of checking things out, and that's unfortunate. So where possible, it's always a good idea to keep specimens, at least as far as and until they've been actually verified. Okay, that's me done. So thanks very much for listening. Sorry it's gone on a little bit long, but we did start a little bit late. And particular thanks, of course, to all of the recorders submitting their records. And thank you to the Leicestershire and Rutland Entomological Society for inviting me to talk to you. So back to the other Alan.